Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ian Campbell. I am the Vice President of Operations for PASIC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I am your moderator for this afternoon's broadcast. Great to have you on board. We have terrific uptake for today's broadcast. We have about 150 people signed up from 60 plus countries right across Canada. So welcome. Welcome to first timers, a number of you on board today. I want to thank my colleague, Danica Hall, who's working behind the scenes to make sure things go smoothly today. We have 90 minutes of discussion planned, and we hope you find it entertaining. So, Danica, if I could ask you to put up the agenda. So, very simple agenda. I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. I'm going to introduce our featured speaker, Matt Moore, and we're going to close the broadcast talking about our next event, which is on November 27th. And in terms of housekeeping items, you're very familiar. We've been using this Teams platform for a long, long time. You see the taskbar on the top. There's a chat, there is a raise your hand, and there are questions and answers as well, Q&A. So you have three ways of getting your points across to us. We encourage your feedback during the broadcast. That makes it more conversational. And our speaker is going to be covering a lot of ground. So heavy slide deck, and you'll get a copy of that later on. But we'd appreciate your questions or comments in real time so that you don't forget if we ask you at the end of the broadcast to think back what questions you have for Matt. So the Competition Act is in full swing during the broadcast. Antitrust compliance is in effect. You are competitors. You remain competitors throughout the broadcast. This is not a scheme on the industry's part. We're going to close the broadcast. I'll talk about a satisfaction survey that you're going to get tomorrow, and your questions and comments certainly help us to plan out future events. We are meeting as a committee. Our planning committee is meeting in early December to plan out our 6 events for next year, the speakers and topics, and we certainly appreciate your input for that. Okay, so now let's move to our speaker. And Matt, you can turn on your camera and activate your mic. Matt Moore is Senior Vice President, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and the Highway Loss Data Institute. Many of you will recognize Matt from a few years ago. He was on to talk about automated vehicles. Autonomous vehicles. And very, very popular, stellar feedback from that. So we brought back Matt. We initially threw around the idea of talking about electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries and the dangers of that. But we've kind of broadened the discussion. We're going to be talking about the impact of electric vehicles on automobile safety and automobile insurance in general. So there's lots more implications, not just lithium-ion batteries. Matt's going to touch on that, but he's going to open up with a much broader discussion about safety and insurance implications. And I think there was something else I was going to tell you, but I forgot now. It'll come to me. But Matt is coming to us. I guess I was going to tell you, Matt comes to us from the US. So a lot of our broadcasts, we go looking for speakers abroad for implications, issues that could impact Canada. And certainly Matt has had a lot of experience with his organizations down in the States and brings a lot of information that can be helpful to our industry up here. So you're going to hear this from the US perspective, but much of this has spillover effects in Canada. Matt's going to be quoting figures that are in US dollars, just be mindful of that. And certainly really appreciate Matt for being here today because he's going to tell you about it. He is the walking wounded right now, and we're going to take a break halfway through the broadcast for a few minutes. We don't usually do that with, we do it with our forum meetings, not so much with the webinars, but Matt's got to get up and stretch and he'll tell you about that. So at 1:45, we're going to take a 3-minute break, do a bio break, check your messages, and then come back and we'll finish the broadcast. So Matt, I'm going to throw it over to you and
Awesome.
and lead on.
Awesome. Thank you, Ian, for that invitation. And thanks to everyone at PASIC for the invitation. I'm excited to be, I think I'm sharing. Hopefully sound is sharing along with that. We'll find out. So some real quick housekeeping. Ian, okay, we're good. Real quick housekeeping thing. As Ian mentioned, I'm currently injured. I'm not looking for sympathy, but I was running and I managed to destroy my right knee, and I need to get my quadricep reattached. And I'm waiting for a call to schedule surgery. But in the meantime, sitting isn't easy for me, so we will be taking a break. You might see me make some faces. Trust me, it is not in response to anything you all have typed in the chat. So Really psyched to be talking to you all today. As Ian mentioned, I am from the U.S. So the research that I'm going to be sharing will be expressed in U.S. dollars and also in English measurements. I apologize for that. And the studies that I've conducted and my the engineers that I work with, the crash tests that they've done, all on U.S. vehicles. But I think much of what we're going to discuss today relates to the laws of physics, and there's a lot of parity between the U.S. vehicle fleet and the Canadian vehicle fleet. So I think much of what I'm going to have to say will be relevant. And if I do share anything that isn't relevant to your universe, I apologize for that. A little bit of background about my organization, or organizations plural, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and the Highway Loss Data Institute. Uh, Both organizations share the same mission, which simply put is to save lives and prevent harm. All of the work that we do is wholly funded by auto insurers in both the US and Canada. The companies that you see listed here represent about 95% of private passenger auto insurance in the US, and there's a significant number of these companies that provide us with financial contributions based on their Canadian market share. And some of those companies are companies that sell insurance in both the US and Canada. And three companies in particular are companies that are primarily Canadian companies. So just on behalf of myself, my colleagues, and literally the tens of thousands of people around the globe who are alive today who would not be were it not for your support of our work, I say thank you very much. So let's kick things off by kind of a walk down memory lane. And part of my reason for doing this walk down memory lane is to emphasize a really key point. And that point is, and I'll spill this piece of the story right here. Much of what we know, at least in the US, about electric vehicles is about cars, electric cars. And there's a reason for that, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But most of the vehicles in the US are not cars. They are pickup trucks and they are SUVs. And that's going to have a lot of relevance to everything we're going to talk about. So, what I want you to think about in your head is like, what was the first mass produced electric vehicle, at least in the US? And I believe it's also true in Canada. Now, if you said or thought the Tesla Model S, you're not far from wrong. But the reality is, in the US, the first kind of modern era electric vehicle, most would say was the 2008 Tesla Roadster. And yeah, the part of my reason for mentioning this is, if you accept as true that is the goal of, or that is necessity to maximize range in order for manufacturers to sell electric vehicles, there's at least four strategies that the manufacturers could employ. One is better battery technology. The second would be better electric motors. Three is to reduce the weight of the vehicle, but also finally to improve aerodynamic drag. Aerodynamic drag is an exponential function, so the faster a vehicle goes, the a little bit more speed nets you a lot more drag. So having a vehicle that is low to the ground, having a vehicle that is aerodynamic is a key to stretching range, because you reduce that drag. And when Tesla introduced the Roadster, basically what they did was they repurposed Lotus Elises, which were already, it's a small vehicle package, it's an aerodynamic vehicle package. And then if you think back in terms of your own memory and think about all the electric, at least the earliest electric vehicles that were available, they were by and large cars. So let's just go a little bit further with this introduction. Some of the folks on my team would argue that, at least in the US, the first real mass market vehicle was the EV1. And this is a great one to introduce this notion that these vehicles are not evenly distributed in all types of places. And the EV1, part of the reason I don't consider it the first mass-produced electric vehicle in the US was it was only sold in the state of California. Actually, in fact, they weren't sold. They were distributed on closed leases. General Motors took all of them back at the end of those leases and destroyed the vast majority of them. But There were a lot of them made and broadly used, at least for a short period of time. I tend to end any arguments about what was the first EV by saying that this is the oldest electric vehicle I've ever seen. This vehicle was belonged to Henry Ford's wife. This vehicle, at least a few years ago, was on display in the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. So let's dive into some insurance results. And we're going to start out by talking about a bit of a strange population of vehicles. And we've got pictures and vehicle names here. And we've been laser focused on this set of vehicles. And the reason we've been laser focused on these vehicles is because if you think about risk or claim frequency, and you accept as true that some amount of the variability in claim frequency from one vehicle to the next has a lot to do with the amount of ground space a vehicle occupies and how much a driver can see from the driver's seat. This study is an excellent population because each of these vehicles were produced both with a gas-powered counterpart and an electric counterpart. And in the studies I'm about to describe, we did head-to-head analyses comparing the loss results for the gas-powered vehicle variants versus the electric vehicle variants. And then it's also good to mention that by and large, at least most of the sheet metal, the exterior of the vehicle, a lot of that was the same. So comparing claim severities for first-party damage here in the U.S., we refer to that as collision coverage. It's a good estimate of what is sort of essentially electric. Because I think at the end of the day, as those who are studying risk, as though from the perspective of those who have to decide on how to price or symbol these vehicles, or folks who attempt, like in my situation, attempt to guide policymakers in terms of what decisions need to be made from a safety perspective about these vehicles. We want to know what is essentially electric, because if we have a few vehicles today that are electric and we accept as true in the future, there's going to be more. We need to know what is essentially electric and what's going to transfer into a more electrified world. So let's get into some numbers on at least this population of vehicles. So again, these are in US dollars, but this population of vehicles, these vehicles with head-to-head counterparts, the electric vehicles in this population much more expensive than their conventional counterparts. They're also significantly heavier. The electric vehicles can significantly heavier than their conventional. Prices significantly higher, weights higher, not by a ton, but still the weights are higher. And in addition to that, in addition to the data we get from our member companies, Carfax provides us with odometer readings for all of the vehicles in our database. And when we use those odometer readings from Carfax, what we see is that the average miles per day of this population of electric vehicles, the average miles traveled far lower than their conventional counterparts. And then sometimes the average doesn't quite tell you the whole story. And so we also parsed out the distribution of miles traveled in some broad buckets. And what you can see here is not only the average different, but the distribution is quite different. And sort of attempting to read the tea leaves or divine from this distribution what this means in terms of potential differences in use cases, I would say these data suggest that those who are driving these vehicles are likely have far shorter average daily commutes. These vehicles, these electric vehicles, aren't being used for weekend road trips and likely not being used for family vacations. So in our database, which the HLDI database, the loss database that we maintain, that database contains the insurance records of about 85% of the vehicles insured for personal use in the U.S. And we use that data to do a lot of studies. This is the first slide I'm going to share that's based on those loss results. So here we're looking at collision coverage. So this is first-party damage, and we're looking at PDL, property damage liability, third-party damage. And in this evaluation, we are looking at each of the electric vehicle relative to their conventional counterparts while controlling for things like the rated driver age, gender, marital status, and sort of what's their risk, standard versus non-standard risk. And in the HLDI database, those who are deemed to be non-standard risk, their collision claim frequencies are about 50% higher than those who are deemed to be standard risk. And also after controlling for miles traveled, what you can see is that the collision and property damage liability claim frequencies are far lower for this population of vehicles. Collision claim severity is about 1.5 points higher, while property damage liability claim severities are 3.5 points higher. And again, reading tea leaves a little bit, that increase in property damage liability likely is indicative of the fact that, well, there's a number of possibilities. So one could be the weight, the weight differential of these vehicles, and that's a key thing we're going to discuss throughout the course of this presentation. Is that, regardless of what country you're in, the laws of physics still apply. And just a reminder of some high school physics: force equals mass times acceleration. So the force in a crash is equal to the weight times the square of the speed. And so anything that's going on in terms of vehicle factors or behavioral factors or vehicle factors related to speed, anything that increases the weight or speed of vehicles that are crashing has the potential to increase the injury likelihood, repair costs, all that kind of stuff. So the increase in PDL could be due to the increased weight of the electric vehicles. It could be due to the potential increase in travel speeds, or it could be that the electric vehicles are just getting into different types of crashes. And we'll say more about that in a little bit. And then here on this graph, when we're talking about overall losses, that's the quote unquote the pure premium, or the average loss payment per insured vehicle year. Now, there's this notion, there's a lot of discussion about behavioral factors related to electric vehicles. And at least initially, there was a lot of discussion about there being a quote unquote learning curve associated with driving electric vehicles. And as a researcher, my assumption had been that, well, if there really was some type of difference in sort of learning how to drive these vehicles, it would manifest itself in a difference in claim frequency. And as you can see from the bars illustrated here, each time we iterated or permutated this study, the difference in the frequencies remained constant until pretty late in the game. And so I was sort of thinking, well, there's no evidence in frequency that there's a learning curve. And then in looking at the differences in severity, that early high severity delta, I always assumed that was something related to the repair shops, the learning curve, or needing to retool or get additional equipment in order to repair these electric vehicles. But then when we looked at property damage liability the same way and saw the same pattern, and in fact, the severity pattern's even more pronounced here, and keeping in mind that when we're talking about the dollars associated with property damage liability claims, we're talking about the cost to repair the struck vehicle, the vehicles struck by these electric vehicles relative to their gas-powered counterparts. So this is an indication that the severity of the crashes that these vehicles are getting in are dropping over time, which could be a behavioral thing. And so we took the data that we had in hand, we took the analysis that we had in hand, and looked at the coefficients from the models that produce those results that we just talked about, and looked at the coefficients related to vehicle age. And you can see things are bouncy here, indicating that there's not a lot of statistical power under these estimates. But if you squint hard enough, you can see there is this downward trend for both coverage types associated with vehicle age, indicating that the severities for both collision, which is the cost to repair the striking vehicle, and property damage liability, which is the cost to repair the struck vehicle, both of those severities are dropping over time, which I think is a good indication that while the likelihood of getting in a crash doesn't change much when you transition to an electric vehicle, but the types of crashes you get into are somewhat different. And we're working to try to understand that. And one of the things that we've done is to look at the differences in repair costs by point of impact. and like consistent with my expectation because there's extra stuff, different stuff in the front end of an electric vehicle, and I'll say more about that in just a second. So the electric vehicles, the claim severities are higher in the front. The rear severities are on par. There's no difference, which makes sense to me because there's minimal difference in the contents in the rear of the vehicle, and by and large, most of us when we're backing up, we're going fairly slowly. And then on the left side, we see parity in the results. The interesting thing is the right side results. Initially, we thought, well, perhaps that the charging ports are overrepresented on the right side of the vehicle, but that wasn't the case. And what our hypothesis is here is that perhaps because the electric vehicles have so much torque, they can accelerate very quickly. Maybe what we're seeing is an increased incidence of folks attempting to do fast left-hand turns across oncoming traffic and thereby exposing the right side of the vehicle to a higher speed collision. And we've actually seen this sort of higher right side claim severity in some other places. And we actually have a study set up right now attempting to dive deeper into this issue, and also a study to try to get a more definitive answer about whether or not the types of crashes that drivers get into in electric vehicles does change over time. So a huge confound, though, in terms of attempting to determine, what is essentially electric about electric vehicles is the fact that manufacturers seem to want to signal, they want drivers to be able to signal to everyone that they're driving something different. And I think an excellent illustration of this fact and this confound related to what's essentially electric. This is a look at Ford F-150s. We've got the Lightning on the right, which is the electric-powered version of the F-150, and then the XLT trim, the gas-powered trim on the left, which is the most comparable trim to the Lightning. And the way you know you're being followed by an F-150 Lightning is it has this light bar, which costs $764 US. Doesn't need to be there. Got nothing to do with the electric drivetrain. And in fact, it's kind of ironic, as we mentioned at the start, if you accept as true that manufacturers are trying to stretch range, to maximize range, why then put design elements on the vehicles which boost the parasitic electric load on the vehicle? The Lightning doesn't need a grille. Actually, it has a watertight storage compartment under the hood of the vehicle. So the front fascia could have been anything. It could have cost anything, but that front fascia is more expensive than the grille on the XLT. And then finally, the Lightning has a crazy expensive set of headlights. Now, maybe if a representative from Ford was here, they would say that those are a low energy draw, high efficiency set of headlights. I don't know, but the reality is those lights are crazy expensive. And I don't want folks to think I'm kind of throwing shade at Ford or being a Ford hater here. It seems like every manufacturer is doing this, and these are sort of the poster children for these light bars. That's the Lucid Air on the left, the Rivian R1T on the right. Both of these vehicles have light bars fore and aft, and all four of those light bars cost in excess of $1,000 to replace, and they don't need to be there. So thinking about or looking at injury metrics, when we look at the U.S. coverage types that cover injuries, so BI, bodily injury liability, those injuries caused to occupants of other vehicles when you're at fault in states that have, U.S. states that have retained a traditional tort system. PIP is personal injury protection. That's for those states that have a no-fault injury system. And then MedPay is first-party injury in states with a traditional tort system. And the big takeaway here is that when we look at using PIP and MedPay as a metric, they appear to be more protective of their occupants. They offer more protection to their occupants from injury when they're in crashes. The bodily injury liability reduction in claim frequency seems to indicate that they are less likely to cause injury to the occupants of other vehicles, which is interesting given that they're heavier. We would expect a heavier vehicle to be more protective of their own occupants, but at the same time, we would also expect them to be somewhat more injurious to the occupants of other vehicles. And so the bodily injury liability metrics is a little bit surprising. It could be that the front ends are more forgiving because the front ends tend to be less dense than a vehicle that has an internal combustion engine under the hood, but that is pure speculation on my part. One of the things that we are most interested in is the crash worthiness of a vehicle from a safety perspective. And the trouble with using injury related claim frequencies is they're a stack of frequencies because you got to get in a crash first in order for there to be any possibility of injury. So these frequencies for injury kind of piggyback on the primary risk of filing a collision claim. And so in order to better get at how well a vehicle protects its occupants, we calculate things we refer to as injury rates. And these injury rates are simply like we take all the collision claims in PIP states, no fault states, and then say how many PIP claims occurred given that collision claims occurred. And then we do the same thing with medical payments claims in traditional tort states. And we believe that these metrics are excellent indications of the relative risk of being injured given that a crash has occurred. And the takeaway here is these vehicles appear to be very protective of their occupants. Now, why might that be? Well, oftentimes the battery compartment is either integrated in or underneath of the occupant compartment. And the manufacturers have gone to great lengths to prevent those battery compartments from being breached and causing the fire risk that I'm sure many of you have heard about. There's a significant concern about the use of lithium ion batteries as a power source because they spontaneously combust under pressure. And then once one of them ignites, it's a real problem to put them out. But it appears to be that at least those battery compartments are conferring a halo benefit. I haven't said anything about vehicle theft yet, and in the HLDI database, we don't necessarily have a marker for whole vehicle theft. So the theft results I'm about to share could be any sort of theft claim, which would include theft of vehicle contents, theft of vehicle parts, or whole vehicle theft. And many electric vehicles are quote unquote connected vehicles, so that they're able to determine where a vehicle is at any point in time. So that could be a significant theft deterrent. Also, I think it's highly likely to assume that most people that own electric vehicles have garages and places to charge them. So they're likely to be behind closed doors in the evenings and not sitting on city streets. And also, it's a possibility that thieves don't know the state of charge of the vehicle, so they avoid stealing electric vehicles for fear of range anxiety. All speculation, but the results are the results, and the theft risk is frequencies are low, severities are even lower, kind of indicating that probably what we're looking at here is theft of vehicle contents or vehicle parts as opposed to whole vehicle theft. And then when we look at the differences in the claim size distributions, we see further evidence that likely what we're talking about here is not whole vehicle theft, and when we're talking about theft claims associated with electric vehicles. So as I mentioned at the start, the vehicle population that I was talking about is a bit of an oddball population of vehicles. And oftentimes after I step through those results, people say, well, what about real electric vehicle? Like, well, what do you mean by a real electric vehicle? Well, a purpose-built electric vehicle. So then I start stepping them through what I refer to as our standard results. And on an annual basis, HLDI produces loss results for the 6 major U.S. coverage types. And we look at relatively new vehicles, and we produce nameplate level results. And in those nameplate results, we also have summary results for vehicles, size, and class combinations. And so here we're looking at the Chevy Bolt, and we consider the Bolt to be a small four-door car. So it's a small sedan. So here on this slide on the left, we're looking at collision coverage. On the right set of bars, we're looking at property damage liability. And what you can see illustrated here is for collision coverage, The frequencies for the Bolt are much smaller than other small four-door cars. The severities are just a little bit higher, very consistent with those results we looked at for the matched pairs. Overall losses for collision coverage a little bit lower. Property damage liability follows almost the same identical pattern. So here, for this purpose-built electric vehicle that doesn't have a gas-powered counterparts, both collision and property damage liability results are lower. And this gets into one of the things you're going to hear me say a bit as we get through the rest of the presentation is, when we're asked the question, what about electric vehicles? I think the only real meaningful answer is, well, which individual vehicle are we talking about, and what are you comparing it to? Because it is really challenging to make any sort of broad sweeping statements, and I will make a few at the end. So as you can see here, this relatively inexpensive, relatively small electric vehicle produced by General Motors, which they've been making large volumes of vehicle for a long, long time. Here we're seeing collision and property damage liability losses that are lower than the benchmark. By contrast, looking at the Porsche Taycan, not a high volume manufacturer, frequency for collision a little bit lower, claim severity for collision crazy high, and so the overall losses for collision higher when comparing the Taycan to other large sports cars. The lower frequencies for property damage liability outweigh the increased severity, so the overall losses for property damage liability are actually lower. So here we get different signal based on coverage type. Maybe indicative of the fact that these vehicles are more likely to get in single vehicle crashes than in at-fault crashes where they're causing damage to other vehicles. Speculation. Rivian R1T. So here, Rivian, basically at this point, we probably can still call them a startup manufacturer, which has implications for severity. They're also crazy heavy. But here we see collision frequency, severity, and overall losses, all high compared to other large pickup trucks. By contrast, property damage liability frequencies are lower, severities high, and overall losses for property damage liability lower. And I promise you we're not going to go through a ton of these slides, but by the end you're going to say, yeah, the answer is, which one are we talking about? What are we comparing it to? So here the Mustang Mach-E, and the Mach-E is made in both a two-wheel drive and a four-wheel drive variant. Collision frequency, severity, and overall losses higher than other mid-size SUVs. By contrast, the property damage liability frequencies are lower, the severities are higher, overall losses are lower under property damage liability. So that's a mix of vehicles, mix of price points, a mix of sort of kind of old established manufacturers, big production run manufacturers versus small batch. And what you can see is the comparisons are just all over the map. Now, oftentimes by this time in a presentation, well, you haven't said anything about Tesla yet. And we're going to take a look at a deep dive we did a few years ago on the Tesla Model 3. And at the time we did this deep dive, what you can see illustrated here was there was not a single electric vehicle that even came close to the sales volumes of the Model 3, which was part of why we had a laser focus on this vehicle. And even when you look at the Model 3 when compared to other mid-sized luxury sedans, it sold in enormous volumes. And there's a lot of hype around this vehicle. And we wanted to just know, what does the data say, to get beyond sort of the headlines and the press. And so it was a challenge to determine what should we compare this vehicle to. And so here across the x-axis, you're going to see we have labels for each of the coverage types. Here we're looking at claim frequencies. On this first set of bars, we are comparing the Model 3, the claim frequencies of the Model 3, to other 2019 mid-sized luxury four-door cars. And what you can see is that the bodily injury liability and the medical payments frequency is far, far lower than that comparison group. Now, the challenge is, though, in terms of attempting to get a really refined answer, At that point in time, the Model 3's price range was between 35 and 60,000, and there's a fair number of vehicles in this control population, midsize luxury sedans, that are pretty darn expensive. There's not a lot of them in terms of sales volume, but in terms of individual nameplates, there are. So we constrained the population in this second run to vehicles with a price point similar to the Model 3. And it didn't move the needle much. And then we said, well, the other thing that's really unique about the Model 3 was that front automatic emergency braking is standard, and front automatic emergency braking very efficacious in terms of reducing claim frequency. So we said, all right, let's only compare it to other midsize luxury four-door sedans at a similar price point with standard automatic emergency braking. And that at least moved the needle a bit on bodily injury liability. So there, what we can see is we lost some of the benefit, indicating that at least some of the delta for bodily injury liability was related to that standard front automatic emergency braking. And then finally, Teslas were the first vehicles to come out with sort of mass market, broad appeal automated driving systems. And the name of the tech has changed over time, and the tech has changed over time. But we then did a pass at the data, constraining it to, looking at vehicles that didn't offer similar functionality. And what you can see here is all the estimates are on top of each other in terms of the confidence bounds. We gain a little bit of benefit under medical payments, and there's actually pretty big movement under property damage liability, indicating that maybe there's an additional risk reduction associated with that automated driving system in terms of property damage liability. But an important thing to keep in mind is that the automated driving software was released coincident with the self-parking software. And we can't separate the benefits of those two things, at least given the limitations of our data. And so what we may be seeing there is a benefit in terms of parking. And we know in evaluations of vehicles that have rear automatic emergency braking, there's big benefits under property damage liability. So that's what we know about the Model 3, at least from that point in time. Now, another key question we have, are these vehicles more or less likely to be declared total losses? And here's a look at those vehicle pairs we talked about earlier. And what you can see here is that the electric vehicles in this population far less likely to be declared a total loss than their conventional counterparts. And when we look at the average salvage recoveries, and actually in this analysis we did add in the F-150, generally speaking, the salvage recoveries are higher, and that's consistent with expectations, given we would expect that the likelihood of a total loss would be a bit lower for the electric vehicles, given that they're a bit more expensive. And as we can see here, the average average salvage recovery for the electric vehicles are higher. Continuing to sort of beat the drum with regard to different vehicles for different reasons do different things. Let's look at Teslas, and here's a breakdown of the comparison groups that we use to evaluate the Teslas. So same body style and market class, and then also additional constraints for prices, because the Teslas don't tend to be quite as expensive as some other vehicles in the luxury classes. But here's a look at changes in total losses as a percentage of collision claims over time for the Model S. So back in 2012, Tesla's far less likely to be declared a total loss than other comparably priced large luxury sedans. But as you can see, by the time we get to 2021, they're almost at parity. By contrast with the Model X from its introduction to current, total loss likelihood very much on par with other large luxury conventional SUVs. The Model 3 somewhat similar to the Model S in that early on less likely to be declared a total loss, but then when we get to 2019, on par with comparably priced and shaped gas-powered vehicles. By contrast, the Model Y in both 2020 and 2021 more likely to be declared a total loss than other midsize luxury conventional SUVs. And so key thing here, it in terms of the insurance equation and what about electric vehicles, each of them kind of sort of is a really different beast. And that's really true of the Teslas and actually with the Model Y, due to the fact that increasingly Tesla is using these gigacasting machines in order to cast large structural components of the vehicles. Those vehicles are changing over time. Now, one of the things I want to talk about, and I think this has relevance both from a safety perspective and an insurance perspective, is that regulation, in particular in the U.S., and at least historically, U.S. federal motor vehicle safety standards and Canadian safety standards are very much on par. And one of at least the place my area of expertise is the U.S. federal VIN standard and the Canadian VIN standard, and those standards are almost the same verbatim. And many of the safety standards are the same, but I don't know the state of this noise standard in Canada. But there was a safety concern in the U.S. that quiet vehicles were more likely to impact pedestrians than vehicles that were louder. And we had done a study that indicated that if we look at hybrid vehicles versus their conventional counterparts, they were far more likely to have a bodily injury only claim. What do I mean by bodily injury liability only claim? It's a BI claim without any physical damage claim associated with it. And we believe this is a great metric to isolate pedestrian related claims because we don't have a pedestrian marker in our database. And when we've back checked those claims with our member companies, they confirm that we are looking at the appropriate claims there. So we were very much in support of this regulation. We actually even looked at animal strike and found similar metrics. Hybrid vehicles were more likely to hit deer. And so U.S. regulators drafted a regulation, FMVSS 141, which required vehicles to produce a sound up to 60 decibels in order to signal to pedestrians when the vehicles are operating in low speeds, to signal to pedestrians that there's a quiet vehicle in close proximity. This is a frustrating thing for me as a U.S. citizen and a safety advocate. In the U.S. we kept kicking this regulation sort of down the road, and it's finally a requirement. Vehicles now have it. Hopefully, I'm sharing sound, and we're just going to play some samples here. Sorry. So that's the Mustang Mach-E. Not exciting. That's the Nissan Ariya. That's our crash test facility, or that's our covered test track in the background. That's the Hyundai Ioniq. And listening to these things is like listening to paint dry, so I won't make you listen to any more of them. But it underscores the fact that regulation just is not keeping up with the evolution of the technology. And I think a far better example of that, these atypical brake light behaviors. So Consumer Reports brought this issue to our attention. This is a video that Consumer Reports produced when they were doing some testing. So this Hyundai Ioniq is going 29 miles per hour. Keep your eye on the brake lights as these vehicles decelerate. So this vehicle decelerated from 29 to 1 mile per hour until the brake lights came on. Pretty radical deceleration, no brake lights. And the ironic thing is, like in the US, the kind of sort of, as simply put, I'm paraphrasing here, the brake light regulations basically say if your foot's on the brake pedal, if the brake is activated, you have to illuminate the brake lights. But these are brake-by-wire systems, and in particular for many electric vehicles, they now have a one-pedal operation mode where basically the driver's just operating the right pedal in order to make the vehicle go faster or slower, and simply taking your foot off of the right side pedal, the quote-unquote gas pedal, will cause the vehicle to decelerate. And the regulations just have not kept up. And when we look at at these vehicles and their likelihood of being struck in the rear, it's interesting. This doesn't necessarily shake out as a huge safety problem. But interestingly, when we shared these results and Consumer Reports talked to Hyundai about this, they addressed this problem and changed the algorithms in the vehicle so that the brake lights illuminate. By contrast, another atypical brake light behavior is for some Mercedes vehicles under heavy, if they come to a full stop, they can remain at full stop without the brake light being illuminated. And what you can see here is they are way oversubscribed in terms of being rear struck. But they've not done anything about this issue. So we're at 146. As Ian mentioned at the jump, we're going to take about a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll get through the rest of the content.
Absolutely. Okay, back in 3 minutes. Thanks so much, Matt.
All right,
Hey, I
Ian.
see Matt is back. That's great. Our system is not frozen up, people. Don't worry. We just took a very short break, and everyone got a chance to get a drink or pick up your messages. And we're speaking with Matt Moore from the Highway Loss Data Institute and the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and right in the middle of a discussion about electric vehicles and safety implications and insurance implications. So, Matt, let's go back to you. And just, sorry, Matt, just 1 second. Let's do a call out for questions or comments on things you've heard to date. Probably a good time to check in with viewers out there. Do you have any questions on materials covered right now, or before we kick into the second half of the broadcast? Okay, I see none. So Matt, let's throw it back to you. Thank you.
All righty. Great. So folks, fire risk is a big concern about these vehicles. And in the HLDI database, we don't have a marker for crash fires. But what we do have a marker for is non-crash fire. And for vehicles that sort of spontaneously combust, and this is a peril that is covered under what in the U.S. we refer to as comprehensive coverage, the same coverage type that would cover things like glass and animal strike and theft. And as I'm sure you're all aware, non-crash fire is one of the least common claims. By contrast, it tends to be one of the most expensive claims. And the next set of slides is a set of slides I typically use for folks that are in the safety community and not in the insurance community. So if what I'm about to say is old news to you, I apologize. This is a look at collision claim frequencies indexed to vehicle age. And so with collision coverage, first party damage, frequencies tend to drop considerably as vehicles age. By contrast, when we look at non-crash fire crash risk, that increases as vehicles age and increases dramatically. And oftentimes non-crash fires are the result of some type of manufacturing defect. And oftentimes those defects or vulnerabilities don't manifest themselves until the vehicles are pretty old. And this is a really important point, I think. And the point is, because non-crash fires are so rare and because they're associated with old vehicles, in order to answer the question with statistical confidence, do electric vehicles have an elevated risk of non-crash fire claims? We need a lot of old electric vehicles. And at this point, we don't have a lot of old electric vehicles. And so when we look at the data, and there was huge debate among the researchers on our staff and our board of directors who review all of our reports about whether or not we should actually publish this study. Is typically for any one result, at least under like collision coverage, we want a minimum of 100 claims. And as you can see here, for this entire population of vehicles across all these years, we only have 56 electric vehicle non-crash fire claims. And so these are the data. We didn't have enough to do statistical controls, but the answer is, if we looked at the observed claim frequency with very, very few observed claims, the non-crash fire claim risk for this population of vehicles that have an EV and a gas counterpart, the non-crash fire risk is lower. And then if we expand beyond the direct competitors, if we do the same type of Tesla analysis, the risk is the same. there's no statistical difference in the risk, and it's going to take a while till we get a good answer on whether or not there is elevated claim risk. Now, in the U.S., one of the interesting things is that although we talk a lot about electric vehicles, there's a lot more turbocharged vehicles in the fleet, and I'll say why that's relevant in just a minute, than there are any other type of kind of alternative drivetrain. And then in 2023, for the first time, electric vehicles actually outsold hybrid vehicles. And then the very next year, things flipped again, and hybrids outsold electric vehicles, and uh, all sorts of reasons why that might be true. I said I'd say a little bit more about turbocharged vehicles. With the turbocharged vehicle, manufacturers can use a smaller, lighter engine package that consumes less gas and produces comparable power to a larger engine. But then you have more stuff under the hood. You have additional air intakes. You've got the turbos themselves. You have an additional radiator, which we call an intercooler, to keep the turbo or the superchargers cool. And then there's additional exhaust lines. And so there's just more stuff under the hood of a turbocharged vehicle. And the collision claim severities are higher. As a consequence, the overall losses are higher as well. And then I mentioned the hybrids, and the answer is kind of somewhat similar there, except frequencies are higher for the hybrids even after controlling for miles traveled, in part because we think a fair number of people that, and the data bears this out in terms of the mileage, a lot of people that buy hybrid vehicles have average longer daily commutes, and so there's just more risk associated with the folks that own those hybrids. And one of the things you may know is that increasingly Toyota and Lexus are transitioning to a purely hybrid fleet. So one of the vehicles in my household stable of vehicles is a Toyota Sienna, and that was one of the earliest mass market Toyota vehicles to go all hybrid. Mine's a 24, and in that year you couldn't buy a gas powered version of that vehicle. And then kind of the enormous news here is that in 25, the Toyota Camry was one of the best selling sedans ever, went all hybrid. And then in 26, the RAV4, which is one of the best selling small SUVs ever, went all hybrid. And there's more weight associated with these vehicles, and there's more complexity. Here's a look at those standard results that we were talking about earlier. In this case, though, we're looking at the Sienna. And as you can see, when we're comparing the Sienna to all other vehicles in the years we struck these reports, looking at the prior generation Sienna, which was all gas, versus the current gen, which is all hybrid, all the collision loss metrics are higher for the hybrid than the gas-powered version. And then under, I'm sorry, yeah, that's correct. And then when we look at the property damage liability, we see that consistent with the additional weight, the property damage liability severities are higher. As a consequence, the overall losses are also higher for the hybrid variant of the vehicle. Here's our best estimate of the glide paths for these various engine types in the U.S. And yeah, in the U.S., there's a lot of political forces acting, at least on the electric vehicle projections here. So we've put some tolerances around these projections, but our best guess is following sort of their natural glide path. By the time we get to about 2030, depending on how this various scenarios play out, will be anywhere between 7% and 12% of the whole vehicle fleet. Now, I'm about to share some maps, and I apologize. They're U.S. maps. And on one hand, you might say that that's got no relevance to my universe whatsoever. But bear with me. I think there's a really important point to be made here at the end, which is relevant regardless of where you live. So in the U.S., back in 2013, basically the Silicon Valley was the only place where electric vehicles registered at all on the map in terms of where electric vehicles were being insured. And then I'm just going to click through these maps over time. And what you can see is that over time, exposure spread well beyond the Silicon Valley. And by the time we get to the last map, There's significant exposure in a lot of places. But the interesting thing when you think about scoring and evaluating risk is that if you take a look at these maps, most of the places with the highest densities of electric vehicles are all urban areas. And the reason I think that's relevant no matter where you live is that prevailing wages are higher in urban areas. So getting back to this question, like what's essentially electric? What's the key risk difference associated with electric vehicles? So we've talked about the fact that they're heavier. We talked about the fact that they get all this extra junk on them. And now what we've just discovered is that these vehicles are disproportionately garaged in urban environments, places where claim severities are heavier. So are the collision claim severity somewhat higher for these vehicles because they're more expensive, because they're heavier, because they're faster, or just because they live in places or crash in places where it's expensive to get them repaired? I think another interesting point, let's take another look at that map really quickly. And remember, I said many of the early electric vehicles were cars. Like think about the Tesla Model 3, the Tesla Model S, many of those direct comparison vehicles that we were talking about. They're cars. They're not SUVs. They're not pickup trucks. So this is where the EVs were in 24 in the US. This is where the pickups are. And, pickups are in different places. Those are two radically different maps. And then we're going to close with some of my favorite content here. Now, keeping in mind this whole notion of force equals mass times acceleration, I'm going to share crash test video of the very first test we did of an electric vehicle. The punchline here is it did great. So that's at 40 miles per hour into a 350,000 pound rigid barrier with a deformable face on it. Tremendous job at preserving the occupant compartment of that vehicle. And let's look at some numbers. Not a big outlier in terms of weight, 3,300 pounds, roughly the same weight as a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord. And so it's heavy for its length and width, but not an outlier in terms of weight. And at 107 horsepower, not crazy powerful at all. And at $33,000, not an outlier in terms of price. And let's look at where it fits or slots in, and just keep in mind, part of what I'm getting at here in this part of this presentation is that whole notion of force equals mass times acceleration. So we got to be hyper focused on what's the weight differential. And as you can see here, if we look at the distribution of all vehicle weights, the VINs from model year 2011, that leaf is right at the center of the peak of the distribution. It's almost the definition of the average weight. By contrast, the heaviest vehicle we've ever crash tested is the Rivian R1T, and that thing weighs almost 7,200 pounds and makes 800 horsepower. And our big fear with horsepower is we know from studies that we've done where we're able to trap vehicle speeds and also get photographs of their license plates and then crosswalk the license plates to the VINs. And then from the VINs, we could get the vehicle horsepower and an associated weight. What you can see illustrated here is from that study, we know that the higher the horsepower in the vehicle, the faster the vehicle was going. And the interesting thing is the speed differential was higher on speeds on roads signed at 40 to 45 versus at highway speeds. And just in case you need a little bit of convincing about the implications of these higher speeds, this is a look at a set of crash tests that we did both on Honda CRVs. That's at 40 miles per hour. That's our standard test speed. By contrast, here's the same vehicle at 56 miles per hour. And basically, at 40 miles per hour, that crash is very survivable. You would walk away from that crash. You'd be having a bad day, but that is not a bad outcome. By contrast, at 56, that crash is likely not survivable. So here's a look at the crash test of the Rivian. This is the R1S. This is the SUV version of that truck. And as I said before, when I was talking about the Leaf, I mean, the punchline is these EVs, every single one of them that we've tested has done really well in terms of its ability to protect its occupants. But our big fear is that the outsized weight of these vehicles represents outsized risk, or in the context of uh, liability insurance, bodily injury liability insurance, third party liability. Uh, the weight of these vehicles is just nuts. This is where the Rivians fit in terms of the weight distribution for model year 2022. You can see they're almost at the far right side of the distribution, indicating there aren't many vehicles that weigh more than them. And then in terms of answering the question, what is the heaviest vehicle out there? It's the GMC Hummer electric pickup. The thing weighs in excess of 9,000 pounds. It produces 1,000 horsepower. Talking about it in the context of that Nissan Leaf that I described earlier, uh, you'd need 2.7 Nissan Leafs to equal the weight of that Hummer. That's just nuts. And then let's look at the way this thing's advertised and some of the tech on this vehicle. Alrighty, so push the button. In case you didn't pick up on it, this thing has a launch mode. It will propel this 9,000 pound vehicle from 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. Chevrolet chose to name that launch mode Watts to Freedom. I'll leave it to you to figure out what the acronym is associated with that. Uh, as I mentioned, our big concern is the weight of these vehicles. This is an illustration of the difference in the average weight of gas-powered vehicles versus the average weight of electric vehicles. And you can see in 2025, the average weight delta for electric vehicles is 830 pounds. Now, let's just talk a little bit more about a few other things. Anytime I'm trying to make sense of things I see that other people have published about electric vehicles, I always ask myself, well, what are they comparing them to? It's like one of the challenges is if you do some all-in comparison of electric vehicles to all other vehicles, the population of electric vehicles is skewed heavily towards new vehicles, whereas the gas-powered vehicles disproportionately older vehicles. And so answering this question, like what about electric vehicles, can be tricky. And then, the point of the set of bars on the left here is just there aren't a lot of electric vehicles. I mean, yes, there are many of them out there, but statistically, there's not a lot of them when compared to electric vehicles. And then the set of bars on the right are illustrating the differences in the vehicle population and sort of the gross body style and price point. So there we just have 5 different sort of classes, if you will: luxury and non-luxury, cars, lux, non-lux SUVs, and then pickup trucks. And what you can see is the colorations in those bars are radically different, in part because early on, most of the EVs were cars for aerodynamic reasons. And then also many of the SUVs were really sort of these very aerodynamic, kind of low, kind of small SUVs like the Tesla Model Y, which, and I'm not being derogatory here, but it sort of has this kind of jelly bean shape, not necessarily something like a Ford Bronco or a Chevy Blazer, or the form factor of like the Rivian R1S. And that's relevant and meaningful because if we look at the likelihood of having crashes around the clock points of the vehicle and what the associated costs of the damage are, and like a rear hit on a pickup truck used to be a relatively inexpensive hit, but now in the case of like the Hummer that we just saw the video, it's got all-wheel steering. So we've got some of the most advanced electric motors in the world in the back end of this vehicle with the same kind of steering gear we would find in the front end of the vehicle. We're talking about massive shifts in terms of repair cost and the nature of repair. And I already sort of sounded the alarm a little bit about this launch mode. And now, because most electric vehicles are almost entirely steer by wire, brake by wire, control by wire, there's a lot of crazy things that the manufacturers can do with these vehicles. And one of our overarching concerns is that a lot of these capabilities are being used to add features and functionalities to vehicles that just encourage drivers to do bad stuff. Let's watch. So it's got a burnout mode. It's got a drift optimizer. It's like, what are you thinking here? And plus the power and the performance of these vehicles is just unprecedented. I remember a bunch of years ago when Bugatti brought the Veyron to the U.S. market for the first time, and we had debate on our staff because at the time our Vindicoder was primarily hosted on mainframe software, and that Veyron was the first vehicle to make over 1,000 horsepower. And we were arguing with the programmer responsible for the software about whether or not we should extend the variable to accommodate this 1,000 horsepower. And I remember him saying at the time, like, there'll never be another vehicle that makes 1,000 horsepower. And now there's multiple handfuls of vehicles that make 1,000 horsepower, and 750, which used to be also an insane number. It's not uncommon now, and even gas powered vehicles are now chasing that number, and it won't be good from a safety perspective or an insurance perspective. I think I saw a question there. And so I'm at the end. So happy to take questions.
Person with in the chat, excuse me, Matt. I have a quick question. Might be interpreting the data incorrectly, but I want to check. From what I've seen, electric vehicles seem to be used more frequently for shorter commutes and city driving compared to conventional vehicles. However, their claims frequency still appears to be significantly lower. Is there a particular reason for this trend? I was curious if it's related to usage patterns, driver demographics, or perhaps the vehicle technology itself.
So to be clear, in the results that we looked at, the data does say that the electric vehicles have lower average miles per day, statement number one. But even after controlling for average miles per day, the claim frequencies for collision coverage are generally lower than comparisons, and that's what the data says. Anything else is speculation. There could be uncontrolled differences in terms of technology, but in the population, at least with the conventional counterparts, there were not huge differences in terms of the fitment of advanced driver assistance systems. So we don't know. There could be uncontrolled differences in the driving population. We do control for rated driver age, gender, marital status, risk in these studies that we've done, but there could be driver attributes or demographic or sort of psychographic factors that we're just not controlling for.
I see Danica put a note in the chat that your slide deck will be available in future and will be on the website as well. I think we're going to send, just because of the size of the file, we'll send members tomorrow a PDF of your slides, and if they want to see then the action element, they can visit our website and see the full hits with the cars. Question for you. So is it mandatory that manufacturers donate cars to you for crash test purposes?
So the vehicles are not donated. We take the funds that the voluntary contributions that we get from auto insurers and basically buy them all from car dealerships.
And so are there ever any manufacturers that don't want to have their vehicles tested, or is that you're just doing this third party, essentially just buying a car and testing it?
We
Okay.
do it third party. We tend to test all vehicles within a market segment. That's not to say we test all vehicles. Like, for example, we don't do sports cars. We don't do pickup trucks above 250. We don't do very large SUVs. But the vehicles that represent the core of the car buying market, we pretty much test them all.
Sir Alistair has a question. Alistair, throw it over to you.
Thanks, Ian. And Matt, thank you as always for the incredible data quality of the work you do and the kind of intuitive way you explain it so clearly. I'm just thinking a little bit about some of the implications that you're kind of teasing out at the end. So these things are heavier, faster, and if I heard you right, much safer to be in. It is just less and less safe to be hit by one of them, with an increasing likelihood that that happens because the driver is empowered with this technology, which can go fast, is encouraged to think they are invulnerable themselves. And so the greater exposure is definitely on the people being collided with, and I assume pedestrians. Is that a fair extrapolation of where the exposure is growing?
An excellent summary, Alistair.
So if I don't own one, I need to get one for defensive purposes.
It's an arms race, and in addition to that, in addition to the elevated risk we're seeing associated, or the concerns we have about the increasing weight of these EVs, just across the vehicle fleet, we're seeing big increases in weight. Like, for example, you think about pickup trucks. So in 1986, when I learned to drive, my father had a Chevy pickup truck. It had two doors, one bench seat. It was two-wheel drive. And basically, those pickup trucks are not available they are available for sale now, but no one buys them. Almost every pickup truck now is four doors, four-wheel drive, these are very large machines. They are heavy machines. And just the entire fleet is tilting towards larger, heavier vehicles. But the place where we see the biggest concentration and the most concerning increases in weight is with the electric vehicles.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments out there?
There are multiple questions in the Q&A, Ian.
In the Q&A, I'm sorry.
Oh, we're in the Q&A. Okay.
I don't know if you can see those, Matt. So are EVs driven less versus non-EVs when adjusting for urban versus rural is the first question off the top.
Yeah, so I think I don't know, that's kind of sort of two questions. So are they driven less? Yeah, the data that we have, the odometer readings that we have from Carfax does indicate that the EVs accumulate fewer miles per day. In addition to controlling for average miles per day, in our analyses, we have the garaging zip code of the vehicle. So we know kind of the postal code where the vehicle spends its nights. And we do, by virtue of having that data element, we incorporate it into all of our analyses and control for, Eric, as you've said, urban versus rural. Yes.
Kevin had a question. What can you tell us about EVs versus non-EV collisions and whether there's any discrepancies between your ratings and real life fatalities and injuries with standard vehicles?
Yeah, so these vehicles, every electric vehicle that we've tested to date has done very, very well in our crash test, indicating that they're very protective of their own occupants. And then in terms of fatality results, they tend to do very well in U.S. fatality numbers. They're protective of their occupants.
Okay. Rolian had a question, and this is about the charging levels. Does the severity cost you quoted for total losses and tires include the plug-in connectors, especially those for the universal level 1 or 2 versus the faster charging level 3 connectors?
And
Test,
no
is that
no
factored in?
differentiation was. I apologize again. No differentiation in on our side in terms of the charging type. So that's not a question I can answer.
Okay, and the last, Tammy had a question just about the availability of the deck, and of course that's everyone's going to receive that. So are there other maybe that's at the top of the, okay, Eric, no, we had that. That may have exhausted all the questions in the chat. I'm sorry, there's a question in the chat now. Just a quick comment.
Got it.
Okay. And last call for questions or comments. Really appreciate you being here, Matt. And
Appreciate the
especially in
opportunity.
circumstances with the injury. I hope that goes well for you and you're on the mend quickly.
Thank you much.
Okay, we will call the event now and cast ahead to our upcoming event. So thanks very much, Matt. We'll keep in touch. It's been a few years, and I know there's lots of developments on the horizon. This is a evolving industry, and lots of data points still to come. So we'll check in with you in the future, and hope to bring you back and talk about another element of highway safety and insurance.
Great. Thanks again for having me.
Here.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. And Danica has put up here, our next event is our final event of the year. And it's our Risk Officers Forum meeting. We're bringing in Jackie Friedland from OSFI. She's going to update us on current PC issues and concerns in the industry. She loves to come in and take your questions and comments. So if you have questions or comments you want us to pose to her, please do that ahead of time, and it will inform what she's going to provide to you. We used to space so that she would come on the 6-month off period when they were doing their risk seminar in the fall. We would bring her in the springtime, but Jackie missed the earlier because of the federal election, couldn't come in last April. I guess it was late March, and asked could she appear late in the year. So perfect time. She's on for our November 27th meeting as the keynote. We're going to be reprising a very popular panel, the reinsurance panel, bringing in as well this time Isabel Lapalm, in addition to Peter Askew and Matt Wolf from Guy Carpenter and Aon Re. Isabel is joining us from Gallagher Re. Is going to be talking about the reinsurance environment. We're going to close off with a discussion with upholsterer Greg Lyle, Innovative Research Group, and Jimmy Jean, economist with Desjardins Group. And they're going to be looking at, I guess Greg's going to look at how's Canada's economy holding up under stress, or sorry, Jimmy's going to look at how's the economy holding up under stress, and Greg's going to look at how are Canadians holding up under stress. We brought Jimmy in a number of years ago, and at that time, this is how things change. He spoke to us in 2021 about the risk of long-term low interest rates. So it's funny how times change. So I hope you can make that broadcast. We'll be sending out the invite tomorrow as well, and give you a month's notice to get signed up for that. You're going to receive tomorrow a copy of our survey, and we use your feedback, as I've noted earlier, for to inform future broadcasts with speakers and ideas. So we certainly invite those, and thanks for being part of today's broadcast. That is our last webinar of the year, with one more forum meeting to come in a month's time. Have a pleasant afternoon, and we hope to see you on November 27th. Thank you.